This is the third in the series of notes on current liabilities. We pick up with commercial paper, which is a form of unsecured short-term borrowing, meaning unsecured means there is no specific collateral tied to it, so it's really just the good faith and credit of the corporation that is standing behind this as security on this kind of borrowing. Virtually all commercial paper is going to have a maturity of 270 days or less, because if it has more than 270 days, it must file this issue with the SEC, which entails a lot more cost and jumping through legal loopholes. Commercial paper is issued at a discount. That is, the company will receive the discounted present value of the face amount of the note, and they tend to be backed by a bank line of credit. Deposits by customers. In this case, we contemplate security deposits on rentals, whether it's commercial or whether it's commercial rentals. When we receive that security deposit, we of course debit cash, and then we credit the liability. And once that's refunded, we simply debit the liability and like security deposits payable or something like that, and credit cash, of course. If the security deposit is forfeited, then we will adjust that into revenue. In other words, if it's forfeited, then we have a liability sitting there. We will debit the liability. We will credit revenue. We may also have advances from customers. We dealt with those a good bit even last semester when we were, let's say, going through the accounting cycle in general. You may recall there that when you receive a payment from a customer, let's say we're a magazine and we issue subscriptions, and so we debit cash, we could either credit subscriptions payable or some other kind of similar liability, or we might go ahead and credit subscriptions revenue. Either way works fine, as long as we make the appropriate adjusting entries, at the ends of the accounting periods, and of course when we actually resolve the, complete the provision of services that we've sold. Property taxes are based on assessment by the locality, the city or the county government that represents the taxing authority. Companies will generally receive a notice of, and as do individuals, a notice ahead of time, and your property taxes are based on some assessment of the value of the property times some tax rate that's been established by law for that jurisdiction. Companies may and individuals may contest that assessed value, and that's why they give you a notice ahead of time. But in general, you don't you do get a bill for this, but it's something that is determined, at the governmental level. Sales taxes. You may not realize it, but when you pay sales taxes at a restaurant or at Walmart or something like that, that Walmart or that restaurant is playing collecting agent for the government. In the state of Alabama, in Montgomery, we have a 10% sales tax. That's 4% for Montgomery, and then 6% that's split up, and I can't remember whether it's 2.5% for Montgomery City and 3.5% for the county, or the reverse of that. But that's where those taxes come from. In Alabama, sales taxes are due by the 20th of the month following the date of sale. So, for instance, if your company generated sales for sales generated in February, they will withhold those funds that customers pay in and create a liability. They'll debit cash, credit sales tax payable for that portion, of the sale. And then by the 20th of the month, they will submit their sales tax report that reports the revenues and also the sales taxes collected. And then when they remit that sales taxes, they'll debit sales tax payable and credit cash. Payroll taxes are pretty complicated to the extent that it is, many companies will tend to farm that out to some company that specializes in sales tax reporting and that actually issues the checks. There are a number of benefits to that for companies that we can talk about in class. The employer basically, though, is going to withhold amounts from the employee's pay, serving as collection agent for the government for state income tax, federal income tax, and also Social Security taxes. But also, of course, besides withholding, the employer is also responsible for a portion of Social Security taxes. But again, we'll have a handout in class where we'll look at this in more detail. Compensated absences. Some employees have contracts that allow them vacation time that accrues over time. Now, many employees may not have any vacation pay accrued until they've been working for 6 months, for instance. But if, for instance, you have a contract or a pay arrangement where your vacation pay accrues over time, then with each paycheck, the employer would debit compensation expense, and they would credit a particular payable account for vacation pay. And so that accrual is going to be based at your current rate. Now later, maybe months later, when you actually take that vacation pay, what they will do is to debit that liability account and credit you for credit cash for the amount that they're paying you for vacation pay. Now, this headline here is, when is a short-term liability actually a long-term liability? If you recall the definition of short-term liability from the very beginning, we said is a present obligation, and the obligation to sacrifice a short-term asset, or to basically or to roll it over or renew a short-term liability. If in fact you intend, or the company intends and is able to convert that short-term liability to a long-term liability or even stockholders' equity, then that short-term liability could be legitimately presented as a long-term liability. The firm must intend to refinance the obligation on a long-term basis if it's going to be classified as long-term. It must show the ability to consummate the financing. And if those two things are in place, then it's legitimate for a short-term liability to be classified in the financial statements as a long-term liability. The easiest way, if you're on an audit, if you want to know if the company, if these two were, let's say if the company was able to do that, well, of course the intentions are, can be one thing, but the ability is something else. Just check to see if they did it. In other words, if they said, we're going to, within the next month, we're going to convert this to long-term debt. Okay, just, the audit won't be over by then. Just wait to see if they did it. Why is it less likely a company wants to classify long-term debt as short-term debt? Well, that's because short-term debts require, they put you under greater pressure. There are greater concerns about liquidity, the company's ability to pay its debts as they come due, versus long-term debt. So it's more likely a company's going to want to classify debt as long-term rather than short-term. Contingent liabilities refer to potential liabilities that will become actual liabilities should certain events occur. Examples of contingencies are unsettled lawsuits. Let's say you've got a customer who was hurt and fell down in your store, for instance, or was hurt by one of your products by consuming your products. EPA violations, violations of employment law, product recalls, those are all examples. A major accounting issue in this case is arriving at an uncertain future amount. That is, since the liability, in one sense, things are up in the air as to how much you're going to have to pay. You've got a liability, you just don't know how much. You've got to try to figure out how much to record right now as of the balance sheet date. Notice gain contingencies are not accrued, but disclosure in the footnotes would be required when there's a high probability of realizing them. Loss contingencies must be accrued if three conditions are met. First of all, there's a likelihood of loss is probable. Number two, the loss is reasonably estimable. And number three, the event giving rise to the loss occurred on or before the balance sheet date. In other words, going back to that definition of liabilities, it's related to a past event. Now, these first two things here, the likelihood of loss is probable, you're going to have to bring in experts. That's generally not something that the accountants are going to be able to know. You might, for instance, have your attorneys working on the case tell you, how do we stand? What what's the likelihood of the company losing or winning this case? Same thing for the loss is reasonably estimable. Generally, we're going to have experts who come in, possibly engineers in some cases, certainly attorneys, experts in the field. Now, the basis in accounting theory for different treatment of contingent gains and losses is conservatism. You might recall conservatism is really an overriding rule that says that we will record losses in certain circumstances, such that were the situation reversed that we stood to generate a gain, we would not record that gain. Case in point would be a lawsuit. Let's say that you've got a case, a customer has a case against you, and let's say it's probable that there is going to be a loss, and you can estimate it. You would need to record that contingent liability. Let's say you have, on the other hand, you're someone else's customer and you have a case against them, and similarly it's probable that you're going to win, and you can reasonably estimate the amount that you're going to receive. You would not record that as a receivable. You would disclose that in the notes to financial statements, but again, it's different treatment of potential or contingent losses versus gains, and it's based in the notion of conservatism. The FASB has established three categories on this continuum of likelihood or probability, and this is where, again, expertise and attorneys are going to have to figure this out. There's a probable. It's probable if the loss is likely to occur. The second category is reasonably possible. That is where a loss might occur, and remote if there's only a slight chance of the event occurring. In estimating the loss, the first go-to here or notion is to use the best estimate available if there is a single point estimate. If in fact you don't have a single estimate, but there's a range of potential amounts that are estimable, and no one best value can be assigned, then we use the lowest value in the range, but by the way, we would disclose the high end of the range. If the loss is insured, we'll reduce the amount of the liability by the amount to be received from the insurance company. So here's a summary of financial statement presentation of loss contingencies. We only accrue if the loss is probable, the amount is reasonably estimable, and the event occurred on or before the balance sheet date. How much we accrue? Well, we accrue the minimum amount in the range, but the footnotes to financial statements would report the possibility of the maximum amount in the range. And of course, if there is I've already said, if there is a point estimate that is the best of those, that's what you would use. If the loss is probable but the amount is unknown, we have to disclose that in the notes to financial statements. But you really can't accrue an amount if you don't have something that's reasonable in terms of an amount to record. Number 4, if the loss is reasonably possible, that middle range or step, but not probable, you don't accrue it, but you disclose the details. You have to disclose any potential contingencies that occurred after the balance sheet date as well. You wouldn't be able to accrue those because they're not past transactions. But anyway, number 5, if loss is remote, it's not accrued, it's not specifically required to disclose in the financial statements. Exceptions, that is, items that have to be disclosed regardless of the likelihood, is the guarantee of others' indebtedness, guarantees to repurchase receivables, and obligations of banks under certain letters of credit. In other words, these are the types of things that would have to be disclosed in the notes to financial statements, where you're giving the details about your various obligations. That's just part of the normal notes to financial statements. Unasserted claims represent potential claims in which a third party has a right but has not proceeded in filing a claim. Tax claims by the IRS, EPA violations. Disclosure is required if the assertion is probable and loss is at least reasonably possible. I'm going to save this part here for class.